When you look back on things, you see things with such clarity. Yeah. And before that, I'd never been aware or around someone who had some kind of psychological issue or mental health issue from any perspective. And so the warning signs there were not red flags to me at all.
Welcome, and thank you for joining me for another episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SASS podcast, coming to you from the Podvlog studio in St. George, Utah, and produced by Markel Consulting, LLC. I'm your host, Dave Markel. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SASS podcast. This is episode 98. And my guest this week is an interpersonal violence survivor, speaker, author, and movie producer, Tracy Rector. I want to thank Tracy for sharing her powerful story of enduring interpersonal violence. And I want to thank each of you, my listeners, for being here to listen to Tracy's story and help bring justice to victims and survivors of interpersonal violence. Here's Tracy. Tracy Rector, thank you for being part of the Sexual Assault Survivor Stories podcast. I really appreciate you being here. It's an honor.
Well, thank you so much. I'm very honored to be here with you today.
Thanks. So that my audience knows, I'll just give background. I think I saw Tracy on LinkedIn. She had said something, or I had said something, and we both responded. And I reached out to her after reading her bio. I just said, I think you would make an excellent guest for my show. And when we talked, she confirmed to me that she would be an excellent guest. So I appreciate your willingness to be here and to share your story. Tracy, let's just start off with some background on yourself. Could you tell us about your life experience in terms of education and where you grew up, where you are now, and things like that?
Yeah, so I was born and raised in Texas, lifelong Texan, raised by Midwesterners, so that gives me a little bit of a twist, not a long-term Texan family. Went to college at Texas Tech in Lubbock and got married right out of college. Thought it was a great partnership, marriage arrangement, and it didn't take long before I saw things a little bit differently. So we were married, ended up having 3 children. Did the best I could with what I had to work with at that point in time. But it was long into the marriage. I always knew that there was something wrong. It wasn't right. This was a relationship that I was living in that it didn't look like any other relationship that I had seen by parents or family or friends. But I couldn't quite figure out what the problem was. All along, I was told that the problem was actually me. You feel that so many times, that's kind of what you think. But I loved being a mother. Raised my kids in what I considered a happy home, the best I could for a long time. We ended up being married for 23 years before I said, I can't do this anymore. And that's really when my children became older, when I started to look at things a little differently. It wasn't just me bearing the burden of an unhealthy relationship, basically. I could see my teenage children. They watch what you do. They watch how you do things. And I was modeling to them a very unhealthy relationship. And that started to bother me. So there were a couple of other things. My father passed away very unexpectedly at the age of 65, and that seems very young as I get very close to that age. And I think it was like this mental point in my life where I was barely holding everything together. And that was such a dramatic and tragic event in my life that everything stopped for me at that point. It was like he was my male rock, if you will, in that sense. And I looked to him for advice and guidance. And I think it plunged me into deep grief like it would anyone else. But I think I grieved for at least a full year. And when I came out of that grief, I saw the world and my life differently. I think more acutely aware of things that weren't working and that life is short. And we need to kind of be in control of our lives as much as we can. So that's kind of what started me down the road of thinking, what is really going on here? And how can I make changes for the positive, whatever that may be?
Yeah. Tell me about your experience at Texas Tech. What did you major in and what got you to Texas Tech to begin with?
Well, I was born in Lubbock. I
Okay.
think that was part of the intrigue. I applied to other colleges and I went to a small town high school. So I don't think I was adequately prepared for entering into some of the colleges that I applied to. But I did apply at Tech and I accepted it. And so I went back out there. It just seemed like that was back to my roots sort of thing. And Lubbock is a very unique town. It's very Texas-y, West Texas, very friendly. And I majored in advertising and public relations, being creative, promoting, that sort of thing, marketing kind of thing.
Yeah.
I worked in public relations for a couple of years, but got married right out of college and then got pregnant very quickly. And so then I became a stay-at-home mom at the point.
How did you connect with your first husband? What brought you two together? And tell me about those early days of the relationship.
Well, I grew up an Episcopalian and he became an Episcopal priest and he came to my home church as an assistant priest right out of seminary. And I was just graduating from high school. So there was an 8-year age gap. At the time, I didn't realize, being young and naive, that can potentially be a red flag, especially at that age. I think when you're 60 and 68, it's not that big of a deal, right? But when you're 18 and 26, it's a pretty big deal. We didn't really date. We spent some time together, and my dad sensed there was some kind of dating situation, and so he put a kibosh on that pretty quickly because he wanted me to go to college. So I went away to college, and we ended up reconnecting again my junior year and got engaged my senior year and got married a few months after I graduated from college. So I was very young, and he was older and wiser and all those things. When you look back on things, you see things with such clarity. And before that, I'd never been aware or around someone who had some kind of psychological issue or mental health issue from any perspective. And so the warning signs there were not red flags to me at all. But now that I have the knowledge, I look back and I see, and the age gap was definitely one of them. And the way he would approach our relationship he was the older, wiser one, so I needed to listen to his advice, that sort of thing. So he was a young priest, pretty quickly got his own parish, very small. We had our first child before our first wedding anniversary, a few weeks shy of that. So it started our family life. And I have to say, the first year of my marriage was one of the hardest and worst years of my life. And so you would think, well, why did you stay if it was that bad? I really have given a lot of thought to this recently and what to do with this information. But being a Texan and raised by Midwesterners, you are given this kind of grit and stick-to-itiveness that you don't quit no matter what. Like you're tough, things are hard and rough. You just pull yourself up by your bootstraps. You just don't quit. You just find a way to make it work. And you're true to your word. You make a promise to someone, you take a vow. That's exactly what it means, So all of those things and the whole faith element pulled into that to where your vows are very important and that sort of thing. So that's really what made me stick it out. And I loved my child and I just thought this is what I needed to be. And I would figure it out and work it out and it would get better. It got more manageable to an extent because I was able to change my behavior, not him changing his behavior, but my behavior and the way I looked at things so that I could survive that. Ended up having another child a couple of years later. And by that time, we really just kind of made a way to make our family work. It's kind of an unusual situation. He was an Episcopal priest, but when we were married, we had been married about 6 or 7 years. And the Episcopal Church was going through some tremendous turmoil at that time. Basically, a red and blue or right and a left kind of situation. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And he chose to look at alternatives. And so, long story short, he ended up becoming a married Catholic priest. It's a very unusual situation, but that's another long podcast story. Anyway, he became a married Catholic priest. This is very unusual. It was a short time period that the Pope allowed some of these Protestant ministers to change because of the extreme nature of what the Episcopal Church was doing, which you look back on, it wasn't really that extreme. They were allowing women to be ordained as ministers. To some, that was extreme. So he became a Catholic priest. So being a married Catholic priest, his pedestal just got a little bit higher, if that makes any sense at all.
It does, yeah.
So being married to a minister we lived in a glass house. I mean, they all do. And especially the bigger churches, as he got into larger churches and when he became Catholic and was in bigger churches, our family was of tremendous intrigue and interest to people because they'd never experienced a family where the minister was married. So there was that part of it. But that really added an element to our relationship because he was very special in that regard. It made his importance elevated. It created a situation where he thought I needed to be more serving of him so that his importance could be accentuated. And that's a whole part of the spiritual abuse, faith abuse piece of my relationship. So it complicates things, especially if someone is not of a faith or a spiritual person. It's hard for them to understand how that it's like it gets its claws into you. And there's the shame and the guilt and the isolation if you are not in line with what the ethos of your religion is. So all plays into an abusive relationship.
Yeah, you're looked at as a rebellious wife or non-conforming, and it causes problems. So you experienced that. You saw him being magnified in the parish. You started conforming to that, but what was the early impact on you? How did you cope?
Well, a big part of it was I lost myself. I mean, to be honest, I lost who I was, who I could have been, who I was supposed to be, because I was acquiescing so much. That was the only place that I got the positive feedback was when I would do those things. So it's a slow, what I describe it as a slow drip, 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 like a drippy faucet. It's not this gush of water coming at you. It's a slow drip. It happens so gradually over a period of time that when you're in it, you don't really notice it until later, and you look back and you see the drips, and that was a drip and that was a drip. And so it's one of those things in hindsight that you become more aware of. But there was an expectation for me to conform and to be that priest wife, even though there wasn't a model for that in the Catholic Church. I think it made it harder because people were so interested. So for him, it was heightened because not only was a priest, and this doesn't come as a surprise to most people, but he was also a narcissist. And so everything was geared towards optics and how everything looked from the outside looking into our families. Those are the things that were very important to him. So how I behaved, how I dressed, things that I said, who I was friends with, who I wasn't friends with. Those things were very important to him. That required a lot of control on his part, needless to say. I'm not a quiet person or an unopinionated woman. I do have strong opinions about things, and I would speak up. And that caused a lot of conflict and friction in the relationship. And he would always equate it, pull it back and turn it around. And it was a faith issue. It was a spiritual issue. I was not listening to God. I was not listening to him. God was messaging him, his message through him to me, sort of thing. So I needed to get in line. You know, even at some point, my salvation was in jeopardy, according to him. So that's a serious mind game. And at the time, I was a very faithful woman. And so that was important to me. My faith was important, and my salvation was important, and modeling what I needed to model for my children was important as well. It's interesting, when I do look back, there was always this, what you might call an instinct or an inner voice that was in complete conflict with who I was being as a mother, as a wife, as a woman, as a person. I never really had developed that or fed it or educated my instincts in that sense or owned it. And being married so young, as a young adult, I was never given the opportunity to even explore that. It's interesting. One of the statements that stuck with me so much after I left the relationship was one of my brothers made a comment to my mother about 6 months after the divorce that he says, "I think we have our Tracy back." That caught me. First of all, I didn't know anyone else was aware of it. And second of all, I didn't know it was that dramatic. It's like you become someone that you're not, because that's what's expected of you in that moment. And that slow drip, drip, it's the same thing. You slowly become this other person, and you even forget who you are in a lot of ways. So there's a lot of that exploring and looking back on after you leave the relationship. In the middle of it, it's really, really hard to see, especially when you have the other nuances of the spiritual and faith abuse going on at the same time.
And I don't know if you're familiar with it, but as a law enforcement official, I was, because I was training and teaching other law enforcement agencies and police officers about domestic violence investigation and those dynamics. But you speak about those dynamics in very articulate and definitive ways that match what's on the power and control wheel. I don't know if you've ever seen that, but it's...
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes. I'm very familiar. I've spoken at conferences and used that as one of the tools. It's an extremely important tool.
Absolutely.
And I love that it was created from survivor focus groups. That survivor's the one that said, this is how he made me feel. This is what he made me do. This is what I couldn't do anymore. That power and control, the coercive control piece of it.
Yeah. And of course, as you've mentioned, with the spiritual faith basis of the expectations that were there, it just compounded everything that was already on that wheel. Things like isolation and control of finances, control of where you are and what you do and who you see and how you interact with other people, even family members. It doesn't surprise me from my experience to hear you say that your brother said that looks like we have our Tracy back. Those are the dynamic issues that family members see, but they don't address with the family member that's experiencing it all that often. Sometimes you have a family member that will say, hey, there's obviously something wrong. But usually, and what's really common, is for everybody to remain silent and to not speak out for fear of hurting someone's feelings or for fear of interfering in somebody else's marriage or relationship. But then once you, as you mentioned, got out of that and your old personality, your previous mindset and belief system started coming out, it's really interesting that your brother would say that. And it makes perfect sense to me.
It does. I have another little story that illustrates the extent of that. I'm a creative person. I love design. Now I know the things that I love. I identify them and the things that bring me joy. But at that time, I didn't even have the opportunity to think about things that brought me joy. This came just like flopping in my face when we had separated. He had moved out finally and took some of the furniture, main thing, all the bedroom furniture. He had brought that into the marriage. So he took all of that and all these other things. And so I had to go find a new bed for my bedroom. I go to the furniture store. The sales lady, as usual, what can I do? And tell her, I'm looking for a bed. And she said, what's your style? What do you like? And I had this deer in the headlights look. I must have, because she looked at me and she said, don't you worry about it. She grabbed me by the arm, just put her arm in my arm very gently. And she says, we're just going to walk around the store and you just look at things. And when you see something you like, you point it out. And so we walked and we saw something that looked just like the furniture that he had taken. And I said, I really don't want that. And she says, that's really good. What was so profound to me is I didn't know what I liked. And now it's very clear to me what I liked. But at that time, I realized that it had been such a long time since anyone had ever asked my opinion about something like that, because my opinion had to be what his opinion was. That's a story that really stuck with me to describe what that process is like and what the end result of it is. It's like you lose so much of your sense of self. You lose your joy. That's one thing that when I speak about this to other groups, one of the things I talk about is the mindset of an abuser. One of the first things they try to do is to take away your joy. They want to be your joy. So everything that brings you joy, they want to get rid of it. They do that by ridiculing it or demeaning it or talking down about it, making fun of you about it or dismissing it or breaking it or getting rid of it or isolating you from it. Anything they can do to take that away from you. One of the stories I tell about that is when I was in high school, something that people wouldn't know about me is I played the drums. I have no idea why I chose that in 7th grade when we went to go pick out whatever instrument we wanted, but I did. And I absolutely loved playing the drums all the way through high school. I loved it. I didn't do it in college, but I loved it. And to this day, I love it. I don't have a trap set or anything like that, but I do have a collection of different drums. And so I would talk about that sometimes. And one of my idols was Karen Carpenter. And after she passed away so tragically, and one of her songs would come on the radio, I knew all of her songs. I would start singing the songs along to the song, and he would say, oh, look, there's dead Karen, and make fun of her and ridicule the fact that I idolized her. It's those little things like that that just cut you right in the gut. That's one thing when I talk to parents that if they ask questions about, or we talk about how do you prepare a child, a girl, to not be able to get into that kind of relationship. And that's just to own their joy, to identify what it is and to know what that is. And I think that's important for anyone who's in an unhealthy relationship to recognize that. If there's something that you enjoyed doing before the relationship and you're not doing it anymore, you should maybe step back and go, why? Why am I not doing it anymore? Does it still bring me joy? why are you not doing it? It has something to do with because they have talked you out of it or made it better for you not to do it, better for us for you not to do it, that sort of thing.
Tracy, I think one of the things you alluded to early on in this conversation is being emphasized by what you're saying is that you didn't experience physical assault. He wasn't beating you or pushing you or hitting you. The abuse was that taking, that stealing of your joy. I wonder if you could talk more about that aspect of someone who is abusive but is not assaultive, that whole concept of being narcissistic and having to have control. You've mentioned some of the ways, like taking your joy, making those little snide comments, but it actually permeates every aspect of the relationship. And I know before you had some stories, I don't know that you'd probably be able to remember some of the stories. There was one about you being in the kitchen with him one time, and I can't remember what the context of all that was, but him expecting you to do or say things to him, especially about happiness. Are you happy? And you saying something to the effect of, no, I'm not. Do you remember telling me about that when we were talking?
I do. There are a couple of things that happened in the kitchen areas. I'll go through. One of them was one of the enlightenments of being a survivor as you look back at things. And I became more and more aware of what domestic violence was. I look back and because I would always say, but he was never physically abusive. And then I would start telling my story and someone pointed out, yeah, he was physically abusive. That story you just told is physical abuse, but I never equated it to physical abuse. So it's all with this spiritual faith abuse thread through everything and the control part of it. So a part of it in our relationship is he took the scripture, the two shall become one flesh, very literally. So now we are one and the same person, basically, in his mind, spiritually and physically. So my body belonged to him. So he could do whatever he wanted to it because we were married and my body was his body. In the kitchen, I'd be standing there washing dishes and he would walk up to me and with one hand grope one of my breasts very hard, acting like it was a sensual thing or a romantic thing, but it wasn't at all. There was nothing about it that was romantic. The look in his eye wasn't romantic. It was more of, I can do this. What are you going to do about it kind of thing. And I would always object to it. And so please don't do that. And then I would get a response of the two shall become one flesh and the woman leaves her family and joins to the man, that kind of all the different scriptural references to that. And that we're married and I should stop being the ice queen and that sort of thing. But it was always that physical aspect of it. So it wasn't abusive in this, there were bruises there, but it was definitely a crossing a boundary of consent within my body. And so that happened quite often. I got to the point where I could tell the look in his eye that this was coming and I would put my knee up, do everything I could, put my arms across my chest to keep him from doing it. And then I would get all kinds of verbal abuse after that. His favorite type of abuse in that sense when I wasn't conforming was silencing, which if you're familiar with the power control that's in there. So not talking to me for 2 or 3 days at a time. The other story about the kitchen that may be the one that you were talking about was, and this is really unusual, and I'll tell you something funny about it in a minute, but the control even went to trying to control my emotions. So for him, being a narcissist, it was always about his comfort and his enjoyment. And so he wanted to feel happy all the time. So being a narcissist requiring other people to make you feel happy. It's that reflection thing of narcissists in the seen as reflection in the pond, reference to that. So he always wanted to know that you were happy, because if he knew that you were happy, then that made him happy because he assumed that he was the cause of that happiness. So in order for him to have a confirmation of this happiness, he got a string of sleigh bells. I don't know, I think they were a family heirloom or something of his. He hung them in the pantry and he requested at first that myself and the children ring the sleigh bells when we were happy, and just ring them anytime you're happy, just full of happiness. You just go in there and ring those sleigh bells. And I was like, over my dead body, am I ever going to do that? And I refused to do it. And he would go in there maybe 4 times a day and ring those bells. Just want you to know I'm happy. I'm happy today. I'm happy to be this. I'm happy to be that, whatever. And I think, I don't even remember if my kids ever rang it. I don't think they did. But to this day, if my girls or I hear sleigh bells ringing, we all just get so triggered. You know, you try to work on those things. I know one time I was trying to train a dog, and one way to do that is you put bells on the door and they're supposed to hit the bells to tell you to go out. And I did that one time And my girls came bounding down the stairs. What in the world are those bells doing in this house? So they had to go away. But it's an extreme example of trying to control someone's emotions. I'm going to control when you are happy, and you will be happy. And I actually told him one time, because he was giving me such a hard time about never ringing the bells. I said, if I'm not happy, why do I ring the bells? And then we'd talk about why I'm not happy. And he says, well, I think you should just ring them anyway, even though if you're not happy. And I said, why? He says, because it makes me happy to know that you're happy. And I said, that's really crazy, because you're going to be happy knowing that I'm lying about being happy. But it was still is about the control and about his comfort.
The true mind of a narcissist.
And the funny part about that little story is, and we haven't gotten to this yet, but I ended up producing a movie to raise awareness of domestic violence. Part of creating the script, the director, and who was also the writer of the script and the producer, she did a lot of things to research everything. But one of the things is she read my personal journals. And that little story intrigued her. And so we actually created that in the movie, because one of the couples is a minister. In the test pilot of the movie, when we tested with audiences, every single one of them pointed out that scene as being unbelievable. Like, it's not credible. Nobody would actually try to do that, control your emotions. It didn't make any sense, even in the context of the domestic violence, which I thought was very interesting. So we actually pulled that scene that's not in the movie.
I think that's interesting in several aspects. I was going to say earlier that the things that you're talking about, I think, are so relatable and resonate with so many of my listeners, but there still are going to be people who have experienced interpersonal violence, the domestic violence, the controlling, who will hear what you just said and say the same thing. No, that could never happen. But as a detective, I remember so many investigations that I did in these situations where the controlling party was that. They were so controlling that they tried to control other people's emotions and thought processes. I won't go into all of them because it's not about me and my experiences. It's about you and yours. But I do want to emphasize how accurate and truthful that situation really is. I mean, it's not something that you're fabricating in order to make this more dramatic or more important. It's actual happenings. And I think it's important for everyone to hear what you just said and to understand that that truly is an aspect of power and control.
Well, I appreciate you saying that. I think one of the important aspects of a survivor telling her or his story is the vulnerability that you have to show in order to truly tell your story.
Yeah.
If you don't allow yourself to be vulnerable, you're not going to be honest. And if you're not honest, you're not really helping to raise awareness of what actually is abuse.
Right.
And I think there's so much more we can do with messaging about what actually constitutes abuse, and focusing a lot on what a healthy relationship looks like, but also what an unhealthy relationship looks like. And then when it escalates to actually be an abusive relationship. And it's that power and control and that loss of agency over your life. Those are the aspects that push it over the line from being just a little bit unhealthy to actually being abusive. And when it's that slow dripping of it is when it's very confusing. And especially, I think it's very difficult for victims when there isn't that extreme physical violence of the pushing and the shoving, the bruising and that sort of hitting and that sort of thing. You question yourself, is it really abusive? And I remember thinking to myself, wanting to tell someone about what was going on in the marriage, but when I would do it in my own head, I always would question whether it really sounded abusive when I started to tell someone, because it's not this great big huge event that happened for the most part. It's these little bitty things that add up over time, and sometimes it's the minutia of it. It's in one example of that I tell that I kind of just, it's almost embarrassing and shake my head about it, was his control over so that I would be someone that he liked. So for example, he loved really long hair on women. And my hair was somewhat long, but I started getting it cut shorter as my children got to be a lot to handle, that kind of thing. And so just trying to do something that's really quick. And every time I would get my hair cut, and you think about that, for a woman, we get our hair cut maybe every 6 to 8 weeks for the most part, like on a regular basis. Every single time I would get my hair cut, I would come home and he would not talk to me for 2 days. He was so upset with me because I went against his wishes. He wanted my hair to grow down to the floor, I guess. And I have lots of thick hair. I could possibly do that, I guess, if I give it enough time. But it was the 2 days of silencing. And literally, It's hard to even imagine what that's like, but you're in the same home with someone, you're sleeping in the same bed with them, sharing the same space with them, and they won't even look at you as you walk by each other in the home. They look away from you, not even saying a word. And from a narcissistic standpoint, especially when it's abusive narcissism, this is their way of punishing you to let you know what it's like to live and exist without them in your life. And it's supposed to make you very unhappy. It's supposed to make you conform. And so after 2 or 3 days or something, early on, I would actually go to him and apologize or whatever. So it would just end and be over with, because it was so unpleasant and so uncomfortable. And he would come to me with his Bible and read to me in Colossians how a woman is supposed to have long flowing hair. And being the opinionated woman that I was, I would argue with him. I said, well, your mother has really short hair. My mother has really short hair. Look at all the nuns that have really short hair. Are they all going to hell too because they have short hair? And he'd say, I'm not concerned about their salvation. I'm only concerned about yours. I said, so you're saying that my mother and your mother and I are all going to hell because our hair is short? But that's the shallow nature of it. And that's the controlling nature of that faith and spirituality. So, I mean, towards the end of the relationship, if he would try to do that, I almost welcomed it. I was like, oh, great. You're not going to talk to me for 2 days? Thank you so much. This is wonderful.
What a blessing.
And that's when you got to really know things are bad. But that silencing, it's a very painful part of that control and that abuse.
Yeah. And not to make light of that. I mean, it sounds almost funny to say, oh, thank you for not talking. But the reality of it is that it probably was actually, like you're saying, a true relief for a period of time, that you didn't have to hear him talking to you, especially in demeaning and controlling ways. I think, Tracy, what's really impacting me and making me thankful that you're here with me today is that your stories are, I know, resonating with some of my listeners. But the other aspect of it is that if it's not resonating with somebody, if they haven't experienced that or don't understand it, that the educational aspect of what you're talking about is so important. It's part of what this podcast is for. It's part of why I decided to do this, is to impart some of my education, my experience, but to hear it from somebody who lived it the way you lived it. I truly appreciate how strong, how resourceful you are with the words that you're using and the thoughts that you're putting into this and the consideration that you did put into it to even be here. It's commendable. I appreciate your strength and your power and your fortitude in doing this. I wanted to throw that in as an interlude. I appreciate you. I
appreciate you saying that. One thing I want to interject here is that I hear often from survivors is they almost apologize that their abuse wasn't that bad because they know other women have had it worse. I mean, I've thought that many times. But as I have gotten more public about telling my story, I don't apologize for it anymore, because I think it's so important for women and anyone who's living in that abusive situation to hear some of the minutia. They need to understand that, yes, even that is abusive. Any aspect of that, which you are losing control of your life and someone else is trying to take it away from you and coerce you to do something or not do something, all of those things add up to that abusive relationship. And so we need to not ever get into a dialogue where we're comparing one to another. It's not important and it doesn't help anybody. So I think it's when a survivor tells her or his story that we honor that story by listening and learning from that experience, and let that person tell us what they went through so that we can learn a little bit more about this horrific, insidious issue that we desperately need to do more.
I appreciate that. And that was so well articulated. I oftentimes will tell victims or survivors who've said some of those same things to me, well, my story doesn't add up to some of the horrific things that some of your guests have said, so maybe I shouldn't be on your show. And I say the same thing. It doesn't matter. What matters is the impact it had on you. And some of that minutia can wear away at who you are, take away your joy, take away your agency and who you are, to the point where it alters your thought processes and worldview going forward. And if something even small, sexually, physically, emotionally, has impacted you to the point where you're thinking about it quite often and it's interfering with your life, then yes, it's serious enough to talk about on this show. That's what this is all about, is having that platform having that freedom and that safe space to tell your story, regardless of how severe you think it is or isn't, what the severity is how it impacts you and how it changes you. I think you really hit the nail on the head.
Well, you're welcome. I think it is important. And I feel very, very strongly about survivors speaking up when they are ready, if they choose to. It's certainly not a requirement from any of them. But I'm astounded at the more I work in this area, when I speak at conferences or to groups or anyone, a lot of people that work in the field of sexual assault and domestic violence, either in law enforcement or in advocacy, are survivors or victims in some way, either a child victim of domestic violence or child abuse or sexual assault of some form. And it's from that survivor mode that passion to make a difference comes from, and that their voice has so much validity and credibility. And I think whatever they say, it's so powerful when they say something to another survivor or another victim. And they don't even have to say, I know exactly what you feel, because you don't know what that person feels, but you know the place that they're in. You know that darkness. And when I talk about that, when I've had friends who've come to me and asked for advice on certain things along this line, and I'll talk about, well, how do you actually know when you can leave? Like what's the point where you actually know to leave? And I said, well, you're in this dark place, in this dark hole, so alone and so by yourself. And it's so cold and dark there. And you realize that leaving, as hard as it's going to be, is easier than staying in that dark place. Mm-hmm. And so you find a way to make that escape and leave that situation, whatever, a relationship, whatever that is. So I think it's really important to listen to survivors and have other victims and survivors listen to other survivors so that they can see themselves in that, but it makes them validated. It's not just me. It really is abuse. I really am living in this abusive relationship.
Are you able to talk to us, Tracy, about that part of your journey when you realized I've got to get out of this relationship? How did that start developing? And then help us understand how you were able to implement getting out of that relationship.
I know there's a statistic that says that it takes some victims up to 6 or 7 times leaving before they actually are able to leave for good. That was not my situation. I think it just took me a long time to make this happen. Part of it was because I wanted to get whatever the other side was going to be. I wanted to be on the other side of it and feel like I did the right thing with grace. And I think when I mentioned before that when my father passed away at 65, my world crumbled. And that was when I came out of that grief, is when I really looked hard at my relationship and myself and realized how unhappy, how deeply unhappy I was. Miserable, basically. And I realized at that time I would live probably another 40 years, and there was no way I could continue doing what I was doing on a daily basis for 40 years. And it crushed me. I didn't really know what to do with that information. And I started trying to make changes in the relationship for the positive that would make it easier for me to stay. So one of the things I did was I wrote a list of things that I did on a regular basis that he could start to do, because he really did nothing to help out in any way, shape, or form in the relationship, the family, the home, and all that. And so it was easy things, and it was just like, you pick a few of these things that you can do so that you could take some of the burden off of me. And he chose to do something that wasn't even on the list. He would do his own laundry. And so he would do his own laundry, and every time we would out and socialize, and being a minister and minister's wife, we socialized a lot with church people. He would end up talking to the women, trading laundry tips, because he was the person doing the laundry. So it was all about the bragging rights of him doing his own laundry thing. But so that just gives you an example of his attitude towards change. There was not going to be any change. And so things got worse, and I just emotionally left the relationship. I didn't even care anymore. There wasn't any anger. There wasn't any interest. There wasn't anything left in it. And I was just kind of existing. And then it was like 3 years after that, on Valentine's Day, which we never made a big deal about, there was always something, a card or whatever. He gave me a book for my Valentine's gift. And I look back on it and I refer to it as, this was the 2x4 across my head, that this is never, ever going to get better. It's just going to get worse. So he gives me a book, and it's by Dr. Laura Schlesinger. If you don't know her, be free to look her up. She's full of all kinds of good advice and bad advice. And the name of the book was The Proper Care and Feeding of Husbands. The time period of that book is very indicative of what the content of the book was. So he had already read the book and highlighted parts in the book he especially wanted me to read. And so this was my Valentine's present. I opened the first chapter and flipped through the book and saw all the highlights, and I just about lost it. So I threw the book on the floor. He would pick it up, and it would be by my bedside table every night. And so finally, I threw it in the trash, and he picked it out and put it in my sink in the bathroom. And I don't know, I think eventually the book got thrown away later on, but that really gave me the message of what I needed to hear, that it is as bad as you think it is, and it's never going to get any better. And there's a funny story about that. Little scenario was about 2 years after the relationship ended. I was listening to the radio, and they were having this contest over who had gotten the worst Valentine gift. And I actually called in and I told him my story. And he says, okay, we are officially ending this contest forever because there's no way anyone could ever top this story. And so I laughed. It made me laugh, which is great. When you can look back on something like that and find humor in it, there's a healing aspect to that. So,
there is.
So that was the beginning of when I realized I couldn't do this anymore. And I actually was at my mother's house, and I kind of broke down and told her, I don't know what to do. I am miserable. And she was shocked. She said, you are a very good actress. I had no idea that you were that unhappy. You made it look like you were very happy. Anyway, ended up going to counseling. She had gone to a counselor after my father passed, and I went to the same one. And my husband at the time made great fun of me for going to counseling, that only really unhealthy and unstable people went to counseling, all these things. And so I'd been to therapy about 3 times, I think, and my therapist pulls a book off of his shelf and opens it up. And he reads me these list of 10 characteristics. And by number 7, tears are falling down my face. I'm like, I don't know what that is, but someone has been living in my home. and this is exactly what's happening in my house. And he says, well, we'll talk about it next week. So I called him on the way home and I said, you have to tell me what that is. I need to know what you were describing to me. Long story short, it was characteristics of a narcissist. And so I told him I was determined to try to fix it and make the relationship work. And he gave me some tips. He goes, I promise you that it's going to make it worse. It's not going to get better. But if you really insist, we'll give it a try. So it did make it worse. And I finally just let him know we were planning some kind of trip or something. And I just would not make any effort to make plans for the trip. And he finally just asked me, you're not going on that trip, are you? I said, I'm not going anywhere with you ever again. And that's when I said I want a divorce. Actually, when I started counseling and I realized how bad it was and that I really needed to do some work on this, we physically separated. I moved upstairs and slept on a twin mattress on the floor for about 5 months. And I told him we needed to work on the relationship. I asked him to go to counseling with me. He refused. He was a minister. He had training. He was educated, and he did this for a living. He was a professional counselor, even though he was a priest. So he did not in any way need counseling. And if I felt like my mental health was at the point where I needed counseling, then I guess I needed to continue to go. So anyway, I finally did convince him to go see my counselor one time. And my counselor confirmed that, yes, indeed. And my counselor actually told me, I have to be honest with you, this is a very intriguing case. And if we weren't already in this counselor-therapist relationship, I would be very interested in counseling him because you don't come across a case like this but once in a lifetime as a therapist. He was a psychiatrist, psychologist. Anyways, I gave him like 4 months to work on it, and it just got worse and worse. Then I just said, yeah, I'm going to file for divorce. And that took it was like 20 months from the time I told him that until we were finally divorced, because he made it as extremely difficult as he could possibly do in every way, shape, or form. I'm convinced that he went to his lawyer and said, I don't want this divorce. Do whatever you have to do to make it not happen. Drag it out. And of course, the lawyer knew it had to happen because if you want it, you get it. But make it as difficult as possible. He absolutely did that. I have to tell you, when it actually was over and finally done, the only emotion I felt was relief. The only thing I felt was this huge weight off of me, that I was actually free, the same way you might think of as if you were kidnapped or a prisoner somewhere. It was that relief, like I'm free. I have a life. I can go do things that I want to do now that I don't have to worry about him. At that time, worry about him stalking me anymore, because during that separation period, there was a whole lot of that going on. So that's also what made it so difficult, that getting out process. When you mentioned something about how sometimes as victims in the middle of it, we make these assumptions that, oh, well, he'll never do that. He'll never cross that line. He'll never go there because he's never done that before. And the same brother that said that comment before asked me when we separated, he said, do you think he will ever get violent with you now that we've separated and he's totally humiliated with his career and that sort of thing? And I said, oh, no, he's never shown any sign of that. I don't think it ever happened. Well, it got really close to that. With as I told you, the stalking piece of that certainly came to light.
I want everybody in the audience to know how dangerous stalking is. It's not something you should take lightly if somebody's stalking you. It is a dangerous, dangerous situation, and you should report it, and you should do everything you can to protect yourself from it. So,
yeah, it is a bright red light shining saying, get help now, because it means that toxic relationship has escalated way up. And if you aren't aware of it, you can just research it or look into it. Most of the women that end up being killed were stalked before they were killed, either by someone they knew or they didn't know. It's an interesting aspect of that time period of the relationship, because especially with a narcissist, when they feel like all that power and control is being taken away from them, they're very desperate to get that back. And so they will do whatever it takes to do that. And that's where the stalking came in. And at first, I just thought it was him trying to cope with us not being together anymore and the ending of the relationship. And so I kind of gave him a little bit of grace in that and a little bit of slack with it. And then it started escalating and getting worse, because what he was doing was not changing my behavior. And so we had to do a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more extreme. During that time period, I was talking with my lawyer. He was saying, let me just get a TR, let me get a restraining order, and we'll make him go away. At that time, it's embarrassing to say that it's like I was still protecting him, protecting his reputation. He was this priest at this big church, and he was the father of my children, and I didn't want to do something that extreme. I didn't feel like he was going to be dangerous, but it got to the point where I would come home, even though the doors were all locked, and there would be this huge box inside my home, things in there that he thought if I saw them would entice me to want to take him back. There wasn't anything like that existed. One time I came home and I saw his car, and I just big sigh. I was just like, oh my God, I'm not in the mood for this. And I also see the truck is there for the septic tank. So the guy had to come like every 3 or 4 months and make sure all the numbers looked right and all that. And so he was there. And my husband at the time had never had a conversation with this septic tank guy before, because he never dealt with anything that had to do with the house or chores or anything like that. And so he didn't know who this guy was. But I go back there to talk to the guy, and my husband is just chatting up with him like he lives there, like they're best buddies and this sort of thing. And I'm looking at this guy like, what is going on? Anyway, we have a short conversation about the septic tank, and I turn and I pointed to my husband and said, you need to leave. You're not allowed to be here. And I walk towards the house, and he follows me. And I walk into the house, and his foot catches the door so that it doesn't close and lock. And he pushes his way into the home. And I said, you have got to leave. You don't live here anymore. And he yelled at me, this is my house too. I can be here if I want to be here. And then he turns to me, and when I tell this story, it gives me chills just talking about it. But when he looked at me, I'd never seen the look in his eye. It terrorized me at the time. And when he said, in the eyes of God, we are still married, and it wouldn't be wrong for us to have sex. When I retell this story, I talk about that fight or flight feeling. I'd never had that before. And I didn't even realize it at the time, what was happening. But I looked back on it and I realized that's exactly what it was. And when he said that, these chills just went all through me. And I turned and walked like I was going to go to the bathroom. But instead, I turned and walked towards the back door. The whole time, I remember thinking to myself, don't run, don't run, don't run. Just be calm. Just walk calmly. So I very slowly, not slowly, but just, calmly, like nothing's wrong. I walked to the back door, and as soon as I hit the back door, I ran to my car. I got in my car and drove off. I immediately called the police, and then I called a locksmith to get new locks on the door. And then I called my lawyer and said, let's get the TRO. Honestly, I look back on that moment, and I do not know what would have happened if I'd stood my ground or pushed back or sassed back to him or challenged him in some way, if he would have gone through with it. The look on his face was he was dead serious. And he was ready to prove that to me. I very much felt threatened. The nice thing about it was after I talked to the police, they actually showed up. 2 officers came to my house, met me there about 20 minutes later. He had already gone. And I told him the whole thing. And I kept apologizing, saying, I hate wasting your time on this. He's gone. Everything's fine now. And I told him what he said. And the officer sat me down and he says, I want to tell you something. This is exactly what you should have done. You absolutely needed to call us. That was a threat. There's no way for you to know, for me to know if he would have followed through it then or if he intends to do it another time. And he says, we'll make record of this, and I'm glad your lawyer's getting their restraining order. And we kind of lived on a dead-end street area. And he says, we will put it in the records that whoever's on patrol in this area, we will just drive down the street and turn around just like we're just checking things out. And if we see his black Mustang, we will definitely pull him over and stop him. Yeah. And that made me feel a lot better about it really was as bad as I initially felt that it was, and that the police took it seriously. And the other really important thing to me is that they believed me. They didn't question me. They could probably see it in my face, but they believed me, and I didn't have to answer any unusual questions or prove to them in any way, shape, or form. So they believed me because I said it. Because I said it happened. They believed me. That really struck me as such an important piece of that. And if I ever speak to people in law enforcement or speak about other things like that with officer-involved domestic violence or things like that, I talk about how important it is for law enforcement to believe survivors.
Absolutely. It's a message that I put out on this podcast. Number one, start by believing. Because not believing your victim is more traumatizing sometimes than the actual trauma itself. And the other thing is stop blaming victims for their own experience. They didn't cause it. And so that's a huge kudo to those officers, especially the one that sat down with you. It's something that I constantly am trying to emphasize in my law enforcement trainings to anybody in the criminal justice system is to believe your victims and don't blame them. So I'm really glad that you brought that aspect out. Tracy, I could talk to you all the rest of this evening and into tomorrow because there's just some amazing things that you're talking about that speak so plainly to the educational issues that I try to expound upon with this podcast. But also, there's so much more that we could talk about. And maybe we should plan on having you back for another episode, because one aspect that I would love to hear about is your healing journey and how you actually got past that through the counseling that you were experiencing and maybe some of your own personality and belief systems and your own spirituality that may have helped you come out of that abuse. And then there's another topic that I want to talk about, and that is what you do today, writing, speaking, and helping others. And I think that would be an intriguing aspect. And I'm wondering if you'd be willing to come back and talk to us some more.
Sure, I would love to do that. I think that is another piece of it, of the story of the relationship, and then after that relationship, what happens then? What do you do with that information? That's the second part of my story, is what did I do with that experience?
And I would love to have you share that with us. I think thousands of people are going to benefit from your episode today. I really appreciate you. And I'm looking forward to doing another episode. I really want to sit down with you again soon.
All right.
I appreciate your time.
I appreciate you. I think that the message is extremely important. What you're doing is really important. We have to talk about it. The number of years that we refused to talk about this issue because it was a private matter, we have to erase that and really bring it out of the shadows and into the bright light so we can see the true ugliness of it and then do something about it.
Absolutely. We've got to normalize this conversation and have it much more often. Things aren't going to change until we talk about this stuff. Yes,
very much so.
Okay, Tracy, thank you again.
I look forward to hearing from you. Take care.
You do the same. That does it for another episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast. My gratitude and admiration go out to Tracy Rector for being a guest on my show today. I want to encourage each of you to learn more about Tracy and her work so that you can then help others become aware of her amazing contributions to helping bring justice to victims and survivors of interpersonal violence, including rape and sexual assault. And keep your eye out for another episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories featuring Tracy as my guest. She'll be back soon to tell us more about her amazing story and her fantastic work. Thank you for tuning in to Sexual Assault Survivor Stories. Your loyalty and listening and sharing with others about this podcast is helping SAS grow, and that's good for all of us because it's helping bring justice to victims and survivors of rape and sexual assault. Please subscribe to this podcast, rate the show, and continue to share SAS with everyone you know, because we all know someone whose life has been impacted by rape or sexual assault. We'll see you next week.